classes that are truly given by masters, people with mud on their boots, people who firsthand fought or committed corruption. Their stories go beyond the theory, go beyond the grand ideas of what should and could be done, but are really hands-on stories on how to fight corruption and maybe to inspire yourself to do it as well. And today we have a very inspiring story. It's a story about the power of collaboration. Maybe if you want to take on the biggest and strongest and most complex networks of corruption, and you're alone, no network, no resources, it might feel like a mountain too high to climb. But our speaker today is going to tell his story that it can be done. He is the leader of the worldwide teams of journalists that unraveled the offshore leaks, the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the Implant Files, the Vincent Files, and the Pandora Papers. Maybe the 6th biggest collaborations in journalistic history. And that these journalists work together is not self-evident. Journalists are lone wolves. They work alone. They protect their sources and protect their stories so that they can have the scoop. But our speaker today, he found a way to turn these lone wolves into a pack of wolves. A pack so vicious that it brought down governments, jailed mighty people, and caused worldwide reforms. And he's going to tell the story of how he did that. And also, he's going to inspire you and give you the tools for you, if you want to start a collaboration, to take on the mightiest thing you can dream of now that seems impossible, and even if you have to start from scratch and all by yourself. Can I get a warm round of applause for Pulitzer Prize and Emmy Award winner and the director of the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, Gerard Ryle. Yeah, you have to keep clapping. It's coming from far. Yeah.
Thank you.
Gerard, good afternoon. Welcome. It's great to have you here. We have quite some investigative journalists in the audience. Is your story today meant for them or for the other corruption fighters?
I think it's kind of meant for everybody. I'm going to show you how you can basically build something from the scratch. And I'm going to try and talk in a way that you can also do this for other things, not just journalism.
I will. I'm going to give you the remote, and I'm going to give you the floor. Gerard, the floor is yours.
Look, this session is really about how you can find stories that can rock the world by first building a strategy, then gathering resources, and finally by building trust. But first, I'm going to talk about one of the most important elements of a story. Surprise! I'm going to tell you something that you probably weren't expecting. One of my first jobs in journalism was at a newspaper in rural Ireland, a small newspaper. And this was a notorious newspaper for the fact that it was actually run by a former circus magician. And this guy had a very unusual approach to journalism. One week, he published an entirely blank front page, except for the headline, "No news this week." One of my big scoops during this era was a report about this mysterious person that was stealing undergarments from clotheslines around the town. The headline, "Knickers Knicker on the Loose." Now you can imagine in this kind of atmosphere that embellishing the truth was not exactly frowned upon. My friend Seamus worked for a small newspaper on the west coast of Ireland, and he claims that one week they were desperately short of a story. So they invented a headline, "The loneliest donkey in the world." And it was a tale, a sad tale about these two donkeys that had lived together for a long time on a small island, and then one of them died. Well, they found a photograph of a donkey, and everything went fine that week. But they'd forgotten one important dynamic. It was the regular practice of the BBC to go through small newspapers looking for strange and unusual stories. So the phone rings. It's the BBC. They're making arrangements to fly over the island. So this presented several dilemmas for our heroes. First of all, they had to find a donkey that looked like the one in the photograph. Then they had to find an island. and then they had to find a way to get the donkey to the island. And this is why Seamus claims to have been on one end of a rowing boat with a donkey on the other end and the sound of an aircraft coming overhead. Now, I've told you a little bit about myself, so as part of this whole exercise, we're going to start doing little things here, and what I want you to do is turn to the person next to you and just introduce yourself just by your name, nothing else. It'll make sense as we go through. As you probably gathered, the career prospects in Ireland, where I grew up, weren't great. So in my early 20s, I actually immigrated to Australia. And there, I realized that journalism was not about entertaining people. It was actually about putting verified facts in front of them. So for the next 2 decades, I spent most of my time as an investigative reporter. I uncovered medical and social scandals. I spent many years investigating corruption in the police. And at one point, I actually faced jail for refusing to reveal one of my sources. But then one day, a story came along that would eventually bring me to Washington, and it was kind of like one of those fairy tales that we used to like to tell in Ireland. This man came along who claimed to have invented a magic pill. And you put this pill in your motor vehicle, and it made your fuel last 20% longer. Not only that, it got rid of all the toxic emissions in your car. Now, already you might be thinking this is a perfectly silly story. But the magic pill man, he raised almost $100 million from investors who all thought they were going to be wealthy when this firm launched on a stock exchange in London. The Australian Trade Commission believed in this firm so much that it devoted an entire section of its website to it. And it paraded the leaders of this company to trade fairs all over the world and to embassies, the Australian embassies. This firm got $600,000 in taxpayer grants for sales it had never made. For what you have to understand at this point is that this was no ordinary company. It had no factories, it had no trucks to move its goods. In fact, it had no goods for sale at all. But it had penetrated deeply into Australia's elite. Many of these elite had shares in the company, and they too thought they were going to be wealthy when this company launched on the stock exchange. So when I revealed this, I faced 4 different lawsuits. I faced attacks in the Australian Senate, and I went through all of the fear and the doubt that every investigative reporter goes through when powerful people don't want something made public. This firm was registered in a place called the British Virgin Islands. And what it was doing is selling shares in the British Virgin Island company and then bringing the money back into Australia as if it were sales of the magic pill. So as long as new investors could be found and the share price kept rising, the game went on. It went on for almost 18 months, even after I revealed that this was a fraud, until finally the company could no longer afford to pay the lawyers who were suing me. By then I realized that I was looking at something much bigger than the magic pill company. I was looking at a parallel universe that allowed this to happen. I ended up writing a book about the magic pill, and then one day, a mysterious package arrived in the mail. It was a computer hard drive, the kind that you can find in almost any store. But this one was packed with details about the company in Singapore that had set up the offshore structures for the magic pill company. Now, I was no expert with computers at this point, but I was able to look at the spreadsheets of some of the clients, and I realized that there were many more clients from all over the world, not just this company. And I started Googling the names, and I remember one in particular that I Googled. It was a Canadian man, and he was missing. He was presumed dead because he was linked to a drug cartel in Canada. But there he was, inside my data, with an email address that had something like ontherun@hotmail.com. And I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be amazing if I could share this with somebody in Canada? But that presented me with a dilemma. I'd spent 2 decades working as an investigative reporter. And investigative reporters, we're lone wolves. We fiercely guard our secrets, even from our editors, because we know that the moment we tell them what we're working on, they want the story right away. And besides, when you get a great story, you want to keep the glory to yourself. But it's funny how sometimes life throws up different opportunities. A few months after I got the disc, I got an email from my old professor at the University of Michigan. Now, I'd spent a year there as a journalism fellow, and he was on a board of an organization called the Center for Public Integrity in Washington, D.C. And as part of the Center for Public Integrity, they had this obscure organization called the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Now, it had existed for about 13 years, and what they would do is that they would raise money and then bring journalists together to various places like London or Stanford or Harvard. They would talk about investigative reporting and then go home to their home countries. And every now and again, money would come into the Center for Public Integrity and they would do a story and they would hire some freelance reporters and then lean on this network to get the stories published. So it was really effectively a way of raising money for the parent organization and pretending that they had this big international network. Anyway, the professor, they said they were looking for this new director. He begged me to come over to America to interview for the job. Now, at that point, I was a newspaper deputy editor of a newspaper and had no real interest in taking this job, but out of loyalty, I went over, and he convinced me to take the job. Now, some investigative reporter I turned out to be. They'd promised me $1.5 million and a staff of 7. I got to Washington, D.C., and I found that there was actually no money. The only grant this organization had was about to expire. And it was from a Dutch foundation that had been criticizing the organization because it was too American. So I thought I was being hired for my journalism skills, but in fact, I was being hired because I was an American. So I got to D.C., and I found that the ICIJ wasn't even on the same floor as the others. We were on level 2. We had bars on the windows and views of dumpsters outside. And one of my 3 staff, not 7, used to catch mice that were running through the room because she didn't want them to be killed by the exterminators. So at that point, I didn't know what to do. So we're going to continue our exercise here. What I want you to do is now turn to the person next to you again and tell them where you're from. Nothing else. Just which country. Anyway, I'm going to... there I was in Washington with basically no resources. I was used to having big newsrooms and lots of people working for me. And suddenly I found I had 3 people, no money. And the only money I had was about to expire. So I had to do something. So what I ended up doing is thinking, well, what have I got? I've got a network, old as it might be, not very useful as it may be, but it was still a network. I had a little bit of money. And I could convince the Dutch Foundation to renew for 3 more years, which would give me time. And the third thing that I had was that I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll simply change the model. Instead of this being a network of journalists, what I'll do is I'll find what I think is really good stories. I'll go to media partners around the world, and I'll get resources from them to do the stories. The first story that I decided to do, because I didn't want to tell anyone about the disc that I have, because I was still keeping my secrets, was a story that had fascinated me for a long time. And this was a story about how corpses are turned into medical products. Now, there are several companies on Wall Street that actually do this. So in America, if you donate your body, like thinking that you're giving your heart and your lungs for transplants, you can also tick a box that allows the rest of your body to be recycled. So your long bones, your skin on your back, things like that. And this has become very lucrative because mostly it's used in cosmetic surgery and other things. So if you need a penis extension, you're likely to be getting human skin, basically. Or if you go in for surgery, sometimes a screw made from human bone is less likely to be rejected than a metal one. Also, there was a very famous story happening at the time. There was a former dentist who had bought a funeral home in New Jersey. And what he had done, because he realized that this was a very lucrative thing, is that he would basically have bodies come in to be buried. And then without telling people, he would extract all of the valuable parts of the body and then manipulate the paperwork and send it off to this company in New York. And one of the famous people that actually got caught up in this was a famous journalist called Alistair Cook. Now, Alistair Cook died at 95 from bone cancer. And what this guy did was took all of Alistair Cook's parts and sent them off and then manipulated the paperwork. I thought this was a really good story, even though it had been reported in America, it hadn't been reported worldwide. So we set off to investigate. And what we found was, in fact, that these companies were getting bodies from Ukraine and then bringing them into Germany, relabeling them as German bodies, and then bringing them into America. And they were doing that because they were less likely to get questioned as to the origin of the material. So we went to Ukraine, we interviewed parents who had signed forms, not realizing what they'd been signed, and thought we had a pretty good story. So my big first lesson at that point was I went to the Washington Post with this story, and I said, hey, I've got a great story. This is what I've got. And they said, Gerard, how do we know that any of this research is real? We haven't done it ourselves. And that's when I realized that the model that I was trying to build needed to involve journalists from the very beginning so that they would trust what we were doing all the way through. And it also got rid of another problem for me, because if you had journalists working with you from the very beginning, then the publication was likely to run the stories at the end, which was something that the Center for Public Integrity hadn't actually worked out. I next tackled the disc that I'd been given. This is from the Firepower, or the Magic Pill Company. This is actually, people think that you get these big leaks and all you do is you sit down and write stories. This is actually what it looked like in the raw form. And in there is about 30 years of records from this firm in Singapore that had been setting up companies all over the world. I realized that I didn't have anything to actually read this, so I decided to play another card. I was a non-profit, so non-profits can beg. So I started asking around, and I found that a lot of tax offices were actually using this very expensive software from Australia called Nuix. So I went to Nuix and I said, hey, I'm a non-profit. I can't tell you what I want your technology for, but if you give it to me and we get some results with it, then we'll make sure that we actually give you credit. I was very lucky because the head of the firm was Irish. So he said to me, here, I'll give you 10 licenses. Go get the bad guys. And that was the first. This turned out to be what's known as offshore leaks. Over the next year, we managed to gather about 42 different media companies who all looked at these files, and we published a story in 2013. Now, obviously, what happened afterwards blew this away, but at the time, people were saying that this was going to be the end of offshore. The French president started saying that we needed to do something about it, and at the time, David Cameron, the former Prime Minister of England, said that they needed to basically set up registers of beneficial owners in all of the former colonies in the UK, which he ended up not doing. But we'll come back to David Cameron later. We published a story, and it was a big deal at the time, and so I started to get more resources. And importantly, I learned lots of lessons along the way. Now, it's my colleague, Marina Walker, who said that if you're building a collaboration, it's really like building a dinner party. So you've got to have people that are willing to be nice. And what we had learned with the offshore leaks material was that there were a lot of egos in the room. And so if you're going to build something in the future, you needed to make sure that you had nice people working with you. Sorry. Yeah, basically, don't pick superstars. Pick people that are willing to talk and willing to collaborate. Other things. I learned also that along the way that you go directly to reporters, because it doesn't matter what language a reporter speaks. If he's an investigative reporter or she's an investigative reporter, they'll do anything to get a story. So at the beginning, I used to go to editors, and the editors would say, why would we want to work with you? I ended up going to reporters directly, and then they did all the advocacy inside newsrooms for me. So through this Offshore Leaks project, we basically learned how to build collaborations. And other things that we learned along the way, too, was to keep everything very simple. You know, at the beginning, when we had this material, we were going to media companies with big, long legal tomes saying, you must do this, you must do that. And then what turned out is that they then went to their lawyers, and they came back to us with all these changes. So it became impractical. So we threw all that out, and we basically have a very, very simple rules now for all of our collaborations, which is basically that everyone must share everything they're seeing inside these documents, and we all publish together at the same time so no one gets the scoop. Now, at this point, we were ready for something much bigger. You probably all heard of the Panama Papers, and you probably all heard about the famous story about how this person called John Doe came to a reporter in Germany and handed documents over, and that we all started investigating it. Well, I can tell you that there were a few sliding door moments along the way. So what happened, that there were actually two sources for the Panama Papers. And the first source came to us through the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung after LuxLeaks. So after we published, oh, totally forgot to mention LuxLeaks, but anyway, after we did Offshore Leaks, we did LuxLeaks, and we did Swiss Leaks. LuxLeaks was a story about how Luxembourg was being used to, as a backdoor way into Europe, basically for big corporations to avoid taxes. And we'd found that story through one of the reporters we worked with on Offshore Leaks. And what he had done is basically managed to get a hold of a whole bunch of records from PwC in Luxembourg, which outlined all of these deals. As a result of that, somebody contacted the Süddeutsche Zeitung and said, hey, if you're interested in Luxembourg, I've got very interesting information about a firm in Luxembourg that's operating in Luxembourg called Mossack Fonseca. And that was the first time we actually realized that we had documents from there. I got a call from Bastian Obermeier at the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and he said, hey, would you like to come and see this person? So Bastian and I rendezvoused in Europe. We rented a car and we went to see him. And this person had then told us that he had basically sold about 1 million documents from Mossack Fonseca to the German government. And then he handed them to us for free. Bastian monitored what was happening inside the German government at that point, and then a few months later, what had happened was the German government started investigating these documents and saw that Mossack Fonseca had been setting up a lot of offshore structures for German banks. And they raided banks in Germany, and this became a big story. Bastian and I had a disagreement at that point because I didn't want anyone to know that we had these 1 million documents from Mossack Fonseca, but Bastian said, hey, it's a big story in Germany, I've got to reveal that we have these documents. So he did, and I'm glad he did, because then what happened was he had the additional information that was picked up by Deutsche Welle, which is the national broadcaster in Germany, translated into English and went around the world. In another part of the world, there was this person called John Doe who had many more records on Mossack Fonseca. And in fact, he had about 40 years of records and about 13.5 million documents. But he'd been trying to give these documents to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. But the reporters didn't see the story. And so when he saw this obscure story from Germany, that's when he went to Bastian, and that's where the famous line came, are you interested in data? And of course, at that point, Bastian was very interested in data, and so were we. I've got to continue your exercise here. What I want you to do is turn to everybody and just tell them what you might be good at, one good thing. Sorry. Go over too far? Can I breathe? No? Sorry. Okay, sure. Okay. after we started getting information about Mossack Fonseca and John Doe, we realized we had a very big story in our hands. So we also realized we didn't have the proper infrastructure at this point. So we had a data team, and but we also had no money. And so what we ended up doing is we realized that we needed to give all of this information to the reporters all of the time. But we also needed to build an online newsroom where they could look at the data and then go onto the online newsroom to work out what was actually in the documents. But again, we had no money. So our two data people came up with a very innovative solution. They basically found open source software that had been designed for librarians to share book titles. And that was the open source software that we used to share the documents. And then we built this, what you're seeing on the screen, which is our online newsroom. It was actually originally designed as a dating website. You're actually looking at a live screen from when we were doing the Panama Papers. You can see that there were little blue dots on the screen, and that meant that people could actually see who was live and talk to each other securely inside this newsroom. And then over a period of time, of course, the reporters were looking at things and then talking about what they were seeing, and that's when the magic started happening with the Panama Papers. Basically, the cluster started happening. So one person would see a very famous sports star and then talk about it on the online newsroom, and then someone else would see a sports star from their country, and after a while, the cluster started happening. And so before you knew it, we had a big story about how these sports stars were putting their image rights into offshore companies, thereby avoiding taxes in the countries where they were. We started seeing all sorts of politicians started emerging. And again, once one reporter saw their prime minister, another reporter saw their prime minister, and after a while, we realized we had something 12 sitting current or former world leaders, and we had hundreds of politicians in the data. We published in April 2016, and I want to talk a little bit about that because I think it's very important to talk about timing and luck. This is a scene in Iceland. One of the big stories we had from the Panama Papers was the Icelandic Prime Minister. And we saw him actually on day one from the very first data set that we got. But what we realized at the beginning was that he had registered this secret offshore company in the British Virgin Islands before he became a politician. So it really wasn't a story. It took a lot of work from a reporter in Iceland to put a lot of context around what he was seeing. And what this reporter in Iceland found was that, in fact, that the Prime Minister had never declared this company. And then he went through all of the records of the Icelandic bank collapses and realized that this secret company was listed as a shareholder in one of these documents. So that's what we ended up. That's what ended up being a very good story. This scene here basically was pure luck. We had originally intended to publish the Panama Papers in, I think it was February or March 2016. But shortly before the deadline, the Germans came to us and said, look, we have these local elections in Germany. When we were first deciding on the date, we didn't realize the importance of this because now Angela Merkel's in trouble. These local elections are very important. So we changed the date to the day after, or the day before, sorry, the parliament in Iceland was due to come back. And, people were there throwing yogurt and bananas at the building and demanding his resignation. And then everything took off from there, because once you had one world leader resigning, which is what happened, everything fell apart. I'm often asked about safety, and I often respond by saying that we've never really felt in any danger from the kind of work we're doing. I know, but a lot of reporters that we do work with have lost their jobs, and they're in countries where they are actually in danger. But we never expected what happened 9 months after we published. This is a scene in Malta. What had happened was that a reporter called Daphne Caruana took up what we had published and continued to work in Malta and found new information. And then one day, she was blown up and murdered. Now, Daphne was the mother of one of our employees, Matthew. Matthew was the person who had actually worked on the technology that allowed us to share the Panama Papers. Now, eventually, of course, Matthew quit and then campaigned for justice for his mother, and eventually it brought down the the government of Malta. And that was actually the third government to fall as a result of this. So I'm going to say that we're able to do all of this basically because of changes in technology, but also because of the underlying weakness of the media. Like when I started off, I had nothing, but I also realized that the media was changing, that the business models that once supported and paid for investigative reporting basically were changing because of technology. And basically, newspapers were no longer having the advertising that would support that kind of journalism. So they were willing to listen to new ways of doing things. And I also thought that the fact that journalism was dying, basically, was very bad for democracy and great news for criminals. Now, here, I want to completely pivot, because people keep asking me, I mentioned at the start that one of the most important elements of a story is surprise. There were three things that I wrote on the whiteboard when I first went to ICIJ. And I said, because the three staff I had said, what are we going to do? And I said, well, we're going to answer three questions with everything before we actually take on any story. And the first one is a simple one, is something of concern. And in our case, is something of global concern. And the second was, are the systems designed to protect people broken? And the third was, can we get a result? Let me explain what I mean by something of concern. Now, if you step out of your front garden one day and you step into a pothole, it's clearly something of concern to you. But if no one else in the room is stepping into potholes when they step outside their house, it's not of general concern. What I mean by systems broken, everything we do, we look for systemic failure. Again, if you're paying your taxes, you expect that you wouldn't have to step out and into a pothole. And so everything we do, we always look for systemic failure. If you don't expect that the medicines you're giving your children will kill your children, but if that's happening, that's the kind of thing we're looking for. And the third thing was, can we get a result? Because everything we do, we want to actually change. We want to show what's wrong so we can make it right. Anyway, in a rather truncated way, I have explained how you basically have to design a strategy, how you have to gather resources, and how you have to build trust. So we basically started with nothing 13 years ago. We now have 50 staff. We have 280 reporters around the world who work with us on a regular basis, and we have about 150 media partners that work with us. But there are challenges that remain. First of all, our model is very much dependent on finding a great story. And it's also dependent on funding. We basically have to spend most of our time doing events like this, trying to raise money. So I'm going to end our little exercise and my talk. Did anyone here say they were from Lithuania? OK, you're hosting our next event. Did anyone here say that they had computer skills? OK, there's our data team. And finally, is there any funders in the room? OK, so you're funding our next exercise. And by the way, come and see me afterwards. Anyway, thank you very much. Questions? Yeah.
In a way, I think we're happy that you have to go around the world telling your story, because it's a truly inspiring story. And I think also some truly powerful people didn't want the story to be told, because we all got bombarded with text messages that there's apocalyptic storms coming, but you told your story anyway, and we listened anyway. Soon, we have some time for questions. If there are questions, raise your hand. But first, I'd really like to know, may I ask you? Hello, oh. Who did you sit next to? And did you? Oh. Just to throw it. Hello, who did you sit next to?
Mr. Steven Azantilo.
Okay. Do you already collaborate, or are you going to collaborate?
We already collaborated, but we need to do more, gathering from what has been shared today.
What was the most inspiring thing you take home with you?
What inspired me most is about being vulnerable and at the same time opening to trust others. Because without trust, what has been shared today wouldn't have been possible. So how do we become vulnerable at the same time, open up to collaborate and embrace other expertise? Because you cannot do it alone. You need other people to help you to do it and go and do it better. Thank you.
Gerard, what was your secret of building trust?
I think the secret to building trust is to really make sure that you listen to everybody in the room. I mean, when we were gathering these big gatherings of reporters together to try and do this, like for instance, small things would come up. When we were doing the Panama Papers, we all gathered in Munich at one point. There were about 105 reporters in the room, and we were trying to decide when we were going to publish. And so we tried to listen to everybody. And then a Russian reporter got up and said, well, we can't possibly publish on this day, it's Mother's Day. Now, it seemed perfectly ridiculous to us that anyone would stop a publication like this because it was Mother's Day. But you had to listen, because in Russia, Mother's Day is actually a really big deal. I also think that it was also about making sure that you weren't listening to the biggest media companies in the room. You were listening to everybody. And so everyone got equal weight in terms of when they decided, these big decisions were happening. And I do think that's all about respect, making sure that, you basically respect everybody regardless of where they're from.
Wow, wonderful. I think we saw a question over there. I think you had a question. You raised your hand. Oh, he's waving his right. Then just throw the microphone randomly to somebody. Okay. There was no one there. We have to investigate where the microphone is now. Yeah. Hello. Who are you?
I'm Eduardo Mosqueda. I'm from Mexico. And how, in this environment of toxic presidents like Trump, like Andrés Manuel López Obrador, like Bolsonaro, that denied truth, that denied facts, that denied science, the journalists still rock the world, still make changes?
I think one of the biggest achievements that I think we've managed to get, and I will say everything we've done, by the way, came out because hundreds of journalists basically sacrificed their time for us. But one of the biggest achievements was that it was very difficult for anyone to question our work, because when you have 400 journalists or 600 journalists all looking at the same set of facts and coming to the same conclusions, it was impossible for anyone to say that this was fake news or this was something that wasn't important. And I do think that you can use the same techniques when you're working as well. Make sure you work with other people so that if you're being attacked, you're not alone. You've actually got other colleagues there that are going to stand up for you.
Lone wolves are more in danger than a pack. Yeah.
Well, yeah.
We have a question over here. Hello, who are you?
I'm Britta Delmas. I work with Public Eye in Switzerland. So, of course, Panama Papers were a very big thing. Still remember the days vividly. I have two questions. One is you have not, in the Panama Papers document database, you do not publish the actual documents and you do not publish the name of the bank holding the account, which of course for us would be very interesting to know. What was the reason for that? And the second, by now, do you get all your stories basically being brought to you, or do you also find stories actively? And if so, do you have any tips for how to find a good story?
Oh, okay. Well, we didn't publish all of the documents, but we actually did publish something called the Offshore Leaks database that was based on the first one. And that gives very basic information like the name of the person, the offshore structure they had, and the address that they were using. The reason why we didn't publish everything is that a lot of the information was very private. We had people's passport details, their bank accounts. We even had passwords to their bank accounts in the documents. And we didn't think that was the kind of information that should be made public. What we wanted to focus on were the public figures in there, the politicians, people who were literally public figures in their country. But we did give all of the journalists access to all of the documents all of the time, and we did not interfere with their editorial process. We didn't tell them what was important for their country. They decided themselves. In terms of finding stories, I do think that one of the most underutilized resources that journalists have is their audience. If you let your audience know that you're interested in something, they will find you. And so sometimes the good way of finding a good story is to publish something very small first, but then what you're doing is you're signaling, you're saying, hey, I'm really interested in this topic. And then what I found over the years is that many people will then come and find you. I mean, almost all of the stories we've found have been because we were brave enough to publish something at the beginning, like Offshore Leaks led to LuxLeaks, which led to Swiss Leaks, which led to Panama, Paradise, Pandora. It's a very simple technique, but always remember that there's always somebody out there who knows more than you do. Just let them know.
Are the hard drives stacked up against the wall?
Everything's in the cloud now. You know? Like we've gone from, when I first was doing the Offshore Leaks, I had this really silly idea when we had the NUX material, the NUX software. I thought what we would do at the beginning is we would set up hubs around the world using this software, because you needed a very powerful computer to work the NUX software. And I thought reporters would come together in these hubs, look at the documents, find stories, and then go home. And it was a complete disaster. I mean, we spent months basically doing this. It was a total waste of time. That's when we realized you need to put everything into the cloud. Also, to get around the idea that you were not giving something to the reporters. If you were to just segment all the Brazilian material and give it to the Brazilian reporter, they would be going, well, how do I know that there isn't something in another country that's of relevance to me? So that's why you've got to give everything to everybody all of the time.
But if a coughing man in a raincoat comes to you in the parking garage and gives you a disc, how do you know that this is a disc worth investigating, or maybe a decoy?
It's a really good question, and I probably should have addressed it, but why I mentioned the fact that we had material from Luxembourg on the Panama Papers before John Doe arrived is that we were able to, and we knew that was real because the German government had bought it and they were acting on it. And what we were able to do was cross-reference that material with the new material coming in from John Doe, because to your point, there's always a danger that someone is slipping something in there or trying to set you up. And so what we're able to do using our data team is say, oh, these match exactly. But clearly, John Doe had much more material, and therefore we had to listen to whatever John Doe was giving us.
Yeah, wonderful. In front of you. Hello. Hi, who are you?
Hi, my name's Ling. I'm from the London School of Economics. I have a question about I think it's probably a little bit easier to start a wolf pack when we have more resources, more knowledge, more networks. But for young people just starting out their careers, do you have any advice for them in this field?
Well, I mean, I think we actually started out with nothing. I think a lot of it's just about building trust. If you're a young reporter, if you're even a student reporter, look around your class and see who else can, who's got the skills. I mean, I know that no reporter has got every skill. I know that some reporters are really good at researching, some are really good at writing, others are really good at, finding information. So, when you work together, I found it works so much better by sharing, but also realizing that none of us are perfect. I mean, I'm a reasonable researcher. I'm a terrible writer. I'm an okay editor. I've got people that can do that. They're so much better than me. But you've got to realize that they're better, and therefore match your great skills with their great skills. And start small. Start with 2 people. That's how you build networks.
You also explained that one of the crucial factors of success is that you have a wide network beyond your own inner circle. On the other hand, if I throw a dinner party, I'm only going to invite people I know pretty well because I don't want to have the people misbehaving.
Yeah, but with us it was different because we had lots of data and we knew we needed reporters from lots of different countries to work with us. And therefore we were able to reach out to these countries and invite them to the dinner party. Now, what happened over the years was that if somebody came to the dinner party and wasn't playing fair and wasn't doing what we wanted them to do, then the next project came along and we didn't invite them. That's how it happened. You basically cull the herd as you go along. And you make sure that you don't have somebody who's going to scoop everybody. Because that's a big danger here. You're giving them access to all of your material, and then they want to get the scoop themselves, so they go ahead of everybody else. So you really need to make sure to make these kind of things work. You've got to make sure that you trust everybody. That's why I keep talking about trust. They've got to trust you, but you've got to trust them as well. And you're not looking for superstars. You're looking for people who are willing to share.
Sounds wonderful. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. There's the gentleman over there. Can you throw? Yeah. Ooh, nice collaboration. Yeah. Hi, who are you?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Casper from the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. I have a question because you mentioned that software and technology is really helping you, making your work a lot more efficient. But I was wondering if there's any way that technology is actually making it more difficult, for maybe in the investigative work. How is technology making it more difficult and easier for whoever you're investigating?
Oh, good question. Look, I think technologies, at the moment, AI, generative AI in particular, is a danger to journalism because it'll basically produce something that's very plausible, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's factually correct. So I do think there's a danger there. I think there's also a danger that the media company owners will think that generative AI is the future and that they actually don't need journalists. So there's an immediate danger there as well. But I also think you should embrace technology. I mean, technology is a great tool if it's used as a tool, not as the panacea for everything, basically. So just see it as a tool. The things you can do these days is pretty amazing. When we get a big data set like the Pandora Papers, we're able to work out pretty quickly every passport holder in there, so we know which countries they're from. We're able to put a spreadsheet into our system now, and we can tell you every member of parliament from your country, their spouses, their children, everything. And we'll be able to tell you how many documents have a hit on that. But it doesn't mean that it's doing all the work for you. It just means that you're cutting down the amount of time at the beginning. So instead of looking at 13 million documents, you're now looking at 3,000, which again is achievable by a human being.
Wonderful. I think we have 2 more questions and we're going to round up. Can we get the microphone over here? Yeah, wonderful.
Okay, thank you. My question has to do with litigation, which is now being used to intimidate journalists, and it's also preventing journalists from being courageous in terms of publishing information, since sometimes they're unable to verify the information. I want to understand, how are you supporting such journalists, and also if there are a lot of collaboration in terms of pro bono support that journalists can also access. My colleague has a question too. So.
Let's first do this question.
Okay, so if I understand your question, you're basically saying that the law is being used against journalists. So basically you're being sued, and that's preventing you to do your work. Again, collaboration is a great way of getting around that. Because we're basically published in the US, we're able to get away with publishing a lot more material than anybody else because we have First Amendment protection there. So what we found with these collaborations is that reporters in countries, they find things that they couldn't possibly publish in their country. So what they do is they give the material to us. We then publish as ICIJ in the US, and often the reporters end up writing about what we're saying, even though they were secretly the ones that gave us the information in the first place. But they're able to do that in a safe way because it's been published internationally. So that's one way around it. I do think, though, that litigation is being misused. I think, Daphne Caruana, who was murdered in Malta, was facing something like 46 lawsuits when she died. And the crazy thing is that after she died, her family had to then carry on and were being sued instead because it basically carried. So it's been misused. The biggest place, of course, is the UK. If you want to sue anybody, you go to the UK and you use UK law. But again, I think there are ways around it, and I do think collaboration is a great way around it.
Okay. Then your neighbor, and then we'll get to you to the last question.
Yes, so Stephen is my name, from Ghana. You just said something that anticipated the question I was going to ask about the death of Carolina. The work that you're doing, from my understanding, you require some determination, courage, resilience, and fearlessness. But you have a family, and most journalists have families. You are engaged in this work. You know that there's a potential danger to your security, to your life. What do you tell your families? How are you able to inject the necessary confidence in your families? And for them to say, okay, fine, go ahead, do what you're doing. But we know that this is the danger. How do you do it? How do you navigate that? Thank you.
It's hard to navigate in some countries. I do think that, often in the West, all we fear about is getting sued. But in other countries, many countries around the world, there's a real danger in publishing this kind of material. Again, I think one solution is collaboration. I do think that some of the biggest successes we've had at ICIJ is publishing stuff internationally that embarrasses a certain country, and that reporters in that country could never publish themselves. So for instance, if you've got a great story in your country, you know you can't publish it. Make sure that the BBC, The Guardian, Le Monde are publishing it, and then the truth at least is getting out at that point, and you're not putting yourself in danger. You're personally putting yourself in danger. I think sometimes you just got to have to give up the story yourself, give up the glory, I guess, but make sure that as a journalist you're getting the truth out.
Are there stories worth dying for?
Look, I don't think so, but I guess this is a personal... I mean, I don't think that you can justify... Nothing can justify Daphne getting murdered. All she was doing was her job. She was revealing things that people didn't want revealed, and they came after her and they murdered her. You can't justify that. Nothing could possibly justify that.
Over there.
Hi, I'm Paul from the United Kingdom. One of the amazing things about the ICIJ and all of the leaks was the shock value that they had, and it really pulled people up short. But obviously, if you keep hearing the same story repeatedly, then there's a risk that people just become inured and say, oh, well, it's another set of leaks, it's another demonstration of people behaving badly, but we know they do that. So how do you guard against the risk that as these stories continue to come out, they have diminishing returns?
Yeah, Panama fatigue.
It's a really good point to make. I'll make 2 points. First of all, I want to make clear that we don't just do stories on offshore. We've done stories on medical devices. We've done stories on corruption in Africa, lots of other things. But let me throw something back at you on that one. When we were doing the Panama Papers, one of the names we came across was David Cameron's father, Ian Cameron. Ian Cameron was basically involved in the offshore world. When we first found the name in there, the reporters in the UK were saying, well, this is not really new, we kind of know this. But we were seeing it through a different lens. And so what they were asking us to do was not to publish that name on the first day, because they thought it was a day 2 story. And we basically said, no, this is a really important story, we're going to name it on day 1. Now, for the next 5 days, David Cameron was chopping and changing a story in the UK. It became the biggest story in the UK and practically brought him down. In fact, his public relations guy wrote a book afterwards saying that David Cameron, by day 5 of Panama Papers, was literally getting ready to resign. And there's an example of sometimes when you see things through an international lens rather than your own lens, you realize this story is very important. And I did actually get resistance from the UK when we went to them with the Panama Papers first, because I said, you've done these other stories, what's different about this one? But if you look very closely, each story we publish has got a new kind of angle. And I do think that that's also very important, that you shouldn't just be publishing the same story over and over again. You've got to find something new.
Wonderful. What advice would you give to the people here, not on the days when you publish and you have the euphoria, but the month before, when you're sitting alone and you're digging through the data and you can't really find it?
Well, I think if you're not a journalist, understand journalism. Really get to understand how you can get a story out. Like many times when I was a newspaper editor, I used to realize that on a Sunday, we were always short of stories. So if you brought a good story to a newspaper editor on a Sunday, you were going to get a really good run for the Monday paper. And the Monday paper usually set the agenda for the rest of the week. So if you're an activist and you're wondering, well, why is no one listening to my story? Or if you've got a really good story, think about timing. I talked a little bit about timing there, but I probably didn't do it enough. But think about, understand how the media works. Very important. And use it to your advantage.
In 10 years' time, what do you still want to have achieved?
Well, I think the problem with finding stories is that you always want to find the next story and the bigger story. To get that same hit, you want something bigger than Panama or Pandora. I mean, Pandora Papers was the biggest in history. I think we had 600 reporters in 117 different countries, 150 media partners all working together. Next one, I want double that.
Let's go for that. Thank you so much for sharing your story. You get applause for that.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. And I hope it inspires us to collaborate and fight corruption together. And I hope you have many more stories to come and to share on this stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening.
Have a great night. Tomorrow we have a masterclass where we talk about motivation. We talk to someone who committed corruption and someone who fights it. What motivates them and how can we tank on his motivation? See you tomorrow and enjoy the party.